All right. Good morning again, everyone. Welcome to this session on APA 7th edition rules and formatting. I am happy to spend part of my Saturday morning with all of you and going over this information. Hopefully it will be useful to you. There's going to be a lot of information that I've packed into here. Some that we'll talk a little bit more expressly about. Others, I may direct you to certain pages in the APA 7th edition manual. So I'll refer to that based upon sort of the chapter that it's in and the section that it's in. But really what I've tried to do here is focus on the things that are typically the biggest questions that I get from students, and also trying to just delineate some of the major pieces that you're most likely going to use in your papers and assignments throughout the program. So that's really what I've attempted to do. As we go through, I'll also have opportunities to sort of stop and answer any questions. So please feel free. You can use the chat feature if you have specific questions that you want to get answered, or feel free to unmute yourself and just interrupt if you have a question as well. Again, we want this to be helpful for you and to answer some of the questions that might come up for you. So in order to get us started, we're going to focus on the section of the APA manual that's really about writing style, grammar, and mechanics. So this is information that's covered in both chapters 4 and 6 of the new 7th edition manual. So a couple of just sort of getting started points. APA generally is really trying to have us be concise and detailed and specific in our wording and our language that we use within our papers. And so a couple of key tips that are connected to this are on this screen here. So when we are writing, we want to try to avoid ambiguous references and wording in choices in our writing. So for example, using we or it is oftentimes maybe assumed that we're talking about people who are working in our field, whether that's school counseling or whether that's higher education professionals in our program's case. But essentially, we want to try to avoid using those words because oftentimes it can be misleading or confusing to the reader about who we're talking about. Additionally, as you write any assignment for any paper that you're writing in our program, while we know that you're writing it for your faculty member, really you should never assume that you know who the reader is. So you want to be as explicit and specific as possible. So that's really a part of also why you never want to sort of use we, because then we includes the reader, right? And again, you never want to assume that you know who your reader is or that they have familiarity with your topic. So as the writer, your job is to be as crystal clear as possible. And so we just want to try to avoid using it or we as much as possible in your work. Additionally, you might also want to watch out for homonyms, right? So the different examples here, it's apostrophe S or it's, right? So one is possessive and one is not. Is it affect or effect? And so being clear based upon what you're writing in that sentence of which is which. Um, is it extend or extent? And making sure that you have that there. Are you talking about a principal of a high school, which is the first option here with ending in PAL? Or is it a principle, something that you have a principled stand on, right? That would be that example. So being clear about which one you're choosing and using that appropriately. Recognizing that using but and however are not the same. They mean different things. So but is as something that you would use to sort of connect what's previously coming in the sentence in terms of maybe there's a change or a distinction there. If you're using however, then you are making a firm sort of stance that there is something completely in opposition or in sort of juxtaposition to what was crafted right before. So again, recognizing that there are some nuances between using those. You also want to try to avoid using contractions in your academic writing. Again, APA encourages this. So trying to avoid don't, isn't, can'ts, right? Like all of those pieces. Instead, we would want to say do not, cannot, is not, right? That's an important piece. Additionally, word level issues also are connected to verb tense. So if we're referring to research or scholarship that's been done in the past, we would want to use past tense. So anytime that you're talking about studies that have been conducted previously, you should be using past tense for that. And then additionally, they also suggest that we just use authors' last names, that we don't need to include their first names. And so we would want to be clear about that. And then again, I sort of make the note, we also want to be careful about the assumptions of their gender too. So avoiding pronouns which may be incorrect for the authors is another important piece that I would just recommend. And so you can, go online and do a search and try to identify who the authors are and use their proper gender pronouns. But we don't want to just make an assumption. And again, that sometimes I've seen in different student work. Additionally, in addition to authors' last names and just focusing on using that, APA also suggests that we do not actually have to use like the journal that their article is appearing from, the title of the journal article or the book, right? We can just get down to what they said in terms of their research. Adding in the extra pieces is not necessarily helpful. You're going to include that in the reference list anyway. So don't actually feel the need to include that as you're writing up any of the research or your own words or your own paraphrased work. It's just sort of, I would say, filler, right? And so what we would much rather have you do is talk a little bit about what their research says and how it's connected to the argument that you're trying to make in your work. So again, APA wants us to try to be concise and have a good tone and be clear in our work. So that means we should use short words and short sentences. It doesn't, long run-on sentences, things that are sort of overly complex oftentimes get muddy for the reader. And so make it simple. If you can divide a long sentence up into 2 or 3 sentences that stand on their own, go ahead and do that, right? There's nothing wrong with having short and concise sentences. Now, the other part of that is we also don't want to have like all sort of like very short sentences either. So you want to have a mixture of how you're constructing your sentences. Sometimes you want to have some information that would lead into your larger sentence. Other times you just want to start and lay it all out right there. So again, having sort of a nice back and forth can really be helpful. Additionally, you want to be clear about your meaning. So I use the example of significant here because as in scholarship and when you're sort of talking about research, significant can mean different things to different people. If you're thinking about significant, then oftentimes in quantitative research, they're testing for significance, right? And so sometimes findings are shown to be significant if there is a high relationship or a test of statistics demonstrates that there is some importance there. For others, using the word significant just means that it's important. And while they are similar, there is a distinct difference between those two things. And so you do want to be intentional about the words that you're choosing and why you're choosing those specific words. Additionally, you don't want to use long phrases unnecessarily when you can just use one word. And an easy one for this is a lot of times we might use the phrase in the ways in which in our writing, but instead of using the ways in which, really, we could just use how. That's essentially the same thing. So again, trying to go for the most concise is oftentimes the better way of doing that. And then additionally, part of sometimes in your classes, you'll be asked to critique, right, the literature and talk a little bit about what are some of the critiques of the research. And that's important. And we need to sort of do a good job of outlining what the critiques are. But we also don't have to be overly combative or overly aggressive in our critiquing, right? So just because there may be some limitations to a study does not mean that those study findings are any less important or that they don't offer some new insight. So again, trying to just frame our language in terms of that there may be some limitations and these may be some pieces that we want to consider, right? So sometimes what I notice is that folks will sort of say, there's a low sample size, and so how could anything be taken away from that? Well, that's what qualitative research is oftentimes, right? And there's a lot of good qualitative research that has told us a lot about students and their experiences in K through 12 and higher education. So we can't necessarily just say that there's nothing beneficial from a low number of participants in terms of takeaways. So again, trying to sort of think about that piece. And again, avoiding academic jargon if you're able. So sometimes we're talking about things that are unique to our field, and that's important, but we also probably then need to define what that means for folks. Because if our reader is not familiar with sort of what we're talking about, then that is going to get us into a situation where they're sort of left outside. And we don't want to have that be the case for anybody. We want to bring them in, we want to have them be understanding what we're trying to say in our work. Additionally, another piece that APA talks about, and this is on page 117 of the manual, is the idea of anthropomorphism. So this is when we put human characteristics onto inanimate objects. And in educational research, it often shows up in terms of, we might say, schools say that, or colleges and universities must address, or research says. But in fact, that's actually none of those things can actually do that, right? So a school can't talk, so they can't say anything. Um, Colleges and universities are brick buildings typically, right? They can't really address anything themselves. Research doesn't say anything either, right? Instead, school administrators say that faculty and staff in higher education must address, or scholars say those would be appropriate because those are human individuals who are doing those things. And so again, sometimes we get into that languaging in our work where we sort of are trying to make a statement about what schools should be doing better. And of course, that's important, but really we need to sort of contextualize that a little bit further and say, it's really school administrators or it's teachers or it's school counselors who should be doing these things. It's not the schools themselves. And again, that is where anthropomorphism can show up in terms of our writing. So we want to try to avoid that at all costs. Additionally, when you're thinking about your work, APA encourage us to use active voice as much as possible. We can use passive voice at times, but oftentimes writers overuse passive voice. And so sometimes it's hard to figure out, am I using active voice or am I using passive voice? A good way to sort of think about this in terms of active voice, typically what is going to be centered at the start of the sentence is going to be sort of the individuals and then the action that they're taking. So if you're sort of framing out your sentence that way, then usually you're going to be more active voice. So I conducted research on is going to probably be more of a chance that you're using active voice, or even if you used the researcher conducted research on is most likely going to be active voice. Another test that I found to be really helpful, and I learned online a couple years ago, is the zombies test. And so if you write a sentence, and then at the very end of the sentence, you attach by zombies, if you read it aloud, if it works, if the sentence is grammatically correct with you adding on by zombies, then that means that you have an example of passive voice. So for example, this first question or this first statement, the tests were gathered promptly by zombies. That grammatically works. And so that's an example of passive voice. However, if you wrote the teachers promptly gathered the tests by zombies, it doesn't work, right? Grammatically, it doesn't flow. So therefore, that's an example of active voice. So again, you can maybe use the by zombies test as you go through your own work. And additionally, I also want to say, if you have software like Grammarly and other sort of accounts that can sort of pick up on active versus passive voice, that's also very helpful too, because again, sometimes if we use those free sort of pieces like Grammarly, it will tell you when you're using passive voice, and that way you can then reframe those sentences and then make it more active. The other piece that often arises as a regular thing that I see in terms of students writing, and APA also talks about this, is that you need to have subject-verb agreement, right? So a verb must agree in number with its subject. And this is discussed on page 119 in the manual. So if we look at the first statement here as in the example, the percentage of correct responses as well as the speed of responses increases with practice. So the percentage is the verb, the subject, the verb is increases. And in this case, right, the percentage would is connected to that it would need to be increases. It would be incorrect to say that the percentage of correct responses as well as the speed of responses increase with practice. So again, keeping in mind just that you would want to have that agreement. Additionally, another piece that's really important to APA is that they say that we should be using first person as much as possible when appropriate in our writing. And many teachers throughout K through 12 and also through undergrad have probably broken you of the habit of using I statements in your papers. And so this is now sort of evidence that you can go back to them and say, you taught me wrong, right? No, you don't need to do that. But essentially, if you are doing something, if you're talking about your own experiences, if you're talking about the work that you're doing, maybe if you decide to do a thesis, for example, in this program, or you're doing any sort of research, instead of saying the researcher, which would be you would instead say, I did this, as the researcher, I da 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 da. And so you do want to make sure that you name yourself and you own it, because by using first person, by using an I statement, you actually take ownership of the work that you're doing rather than hiding behind it in like a third person way where you might say the researcher, right? You start to sort of take away and remove yourself from your work by using third person rather than sort of taking ownership by saying, I did this, right? So again, just something to note. The other piece that I often see that comes up in students' work, and this is an interesting one because grammatically it is not incorrect, but this is an APA specific rule. So on pages 121 and 122 of the manual, they talk about the use of who versus that. So if you're talking about people, APA says that you need to use the word who rather than that in a sentence. So for example, the students who completed the task would be APA appropriate versus the students that completed the task. Grammatically, according to English, that is appropriate, but APA is saying, no, we actually believe that who is more appropriate grammatically in this case. So again, the second statement here, the participants who passed the exam were given course credit. That is appropriate as APA instead of the participants that passed the exam were given course credit. Additionally, there are specific spacing rules after punctuation. And so I'm going to cover a couple of them, but again, there is more detail in this on page 154 of the manual that you can take a look at. But in 7th edition APA, we are to only use one space after the use of a period or other punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. One space after any commas, colons, or semicolons. If you have periods that separate parts of an entry on a reference list, there's only one space necessary. And then also after initials in a name. So for example, in a reference list where we put the author's names, we would need to have a space after the period, after the first and middle initials of the author's name. We do not, though, insert a space after internal periods and abbreviations. So for example, if we are using US to represent the United States, there is no space after the period after U. It all should be put together. Additionally, if we're having AM or PM, it should be A period, M period, no spaces, or P period, M period, no spaces. Additionally, if we are writing in numeric form ratio, maybe 1 and 4, there's no period necessary before or after the colon. So again, just some things to note around punctuation and spacing. And for those of you who were familiar with APA 6th edition, some of these are a change, right? So it used to be that you would have two spaces after periods at the end of a sentence. But again, APA 7th moved us back to just one space. So keep that in mind. Now, I also will say it's very unlikely that most of the faculty will be looking so closely at spaces at the end of a sentence and make deductions about this. But again, you will want to just try to make this regular routine for yourself. And I myself also struggle with the two spaces or one space. So I've tried to revert back to doing just one space in my work. So I also want to point you to, if you go to chapter 6 and specifically section 2 in that chapter, there is more information about when to use a period. And 6.3 talks about when to use a comma, and 6.4 when to use a semicolon. So if you have questions about punctuation, I encourage you to read the information in chapter 6 pretty closely. So numbers is another piece, and on 178, they start to talk about numerical values and how to write those into your work. So if you are writing or talking about a number that is 10 or higher, you are encouraged to and asked to write it out numerically. If you are talking about a number of 1 through 9, then typically we are asked to write that out as a word. So it would be, instead of writing the number 1, you would actually need to write 1 out, O-N-E, right? Now, at the same time, there are very specific rules and exemptions to this. So if you use numbers that represent statistical or mathematical functions, fractions or decimal quantities, percentages, ratios, and percentiles or quartiles, then typically they are going to be written out numerically. So again, you see there more than 5%. If you have any word that begins a sentence, a title, or a heading, when possible, it should be reworded to avoid this. But if not, it should be written out in words. So example here, 48% of the sample. So it should not be numerically written out. But instead, it should be written out as the word 40 and then -8. Additionally, we use numbers that represent time, dates, ages, scores, points on a scale, exact sums of money. So we would use the numerical 2 for 2 weeks ago instead of writing out TWO. If we were talking about that a meeting lasted 1 hour and 34 minutes, we might write it out numerically instead of, again, writing out the words of those values. If we're talking about the age of students that we may be working with, if we're talking about 2-year-olds, then we would write the numerical number 2, and then hyphen year, and then hyphen olds. And again, if we're thinking about a Likert scale where we have 7 points on the scale, then we might say that they scored 4 on a 7-point scale. And again, those are points, and so they are written numerically. You would use words with common fractions though, so 1/5 of the class would be written out. You would use words for universally accepted usage. So oftentimes, like an example here, the 12 apostles or the 5 pillars of Islam, those are written out as words. And when you have numerals that are expressing numbers back to back, you do typically use one that would be written out as in numerical form and then one as a word. So the example here would be two-way interactions, because two is followed right after one another, but in a different way. It would be two numerically, and then two-way is written out, and then interactions. When we also have lists, that's the next piece that we're going to be talking about. When you have a list within a sentence that has 3 or more items, you do need to use a serial or an Oxford comma before the final item. So the Oxford comma is the comma that comes before the and in the sentence here. Participants were similar with respect to age, gender, and ethnicity. So because age, gender, and ethnicity, there's 3 items there in that list, you do need to include the comma before the final item. Additionally, you also want to use a lettered list to identify elements in a sentence or a paragraph that are separate but parallel topics. So it doesn't mean that there's hierarchy here, but they're all equal in terms of their importance, right? So in this section, I will discuss A, leadership theories, B, management theories, and C, adult development theories. All of these are different types of theories, and so they would all be categorized as a lettered list. And additionally, if we do a lettered list, it needs to be lowercase alphabetized within the parentheses. So that's one thing that you'll also want to note. We would use a numbered list, however, when referring to display steps in a sequence. So if things were sort of having to follow sequential order, then you would use numerical values of 1, 2, 3, and so on. Or if there's a specific series of information. And again, those numerical values would either be listed as a sort of like a bulleted list, right? So they would be indented and then 1 period and then the information, and then the next line down would be 2. Or you could also set it up similarly to the lettered list and have it be 1 in, again, close parentheses, and then whatever it is, then comma, 2, and so on and so forth. So those are just some of the basics around sort of our writing and grammatical pieces, things to think about from a technical standpoint in terms of word choice. Before I move on to the next section of this, I wanted to just see if there were any questions from folks. So any questions that folks have before we move to the next? Okay. So again, if you do have questions, feel free to ask in the chat or unmute yourself. Seeing none, I'm going to move us right along and keep going. And in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about elements and format, which is covered in chapter 2. So most of you are well familiar with title pages, right? So in APA 7th, they talk about the differences between professional title pages and student title pages. And so within the work that you'll have within our program, most of you will be using the student title pages. So in the chat, I just sent you a link, and the link will take you to a APA 7th edition sample paper that Dr. Yu actually created last year when giving a similar workshop to this one. But that will have that can serve as a template. If you want to download it from the web page, you can download it to your personal computer, and you can just update that for all of the assignments that you use. But essentially, that is the information that would be required on most of the assignments for your classes within our program. And so again, you will want to format your work just like in that sample template, but also in figure 2.2 on page 32 of the manual. So when you come up with a title for your work, it's important to keep the title concise, clear, and direct. It needs to be it doesn't need to be elaborate, it doesn't need to be overly wordy, but you should include essential terms that are central to your content. So you also want to keep in mind, again, for some of you, you may never submit to an academic journal, but we want to keep in mind that APA rules are also about scholarship, right? And so typically journal articles have a rule that you cannot have a title that's more than 12 to 15 words total. So when you come up with your titles for your own work, you'd want to keep that rule in mind for yourself. And again, this isn't necessarily an APA guideline, but they do say they want to be clear and concise. So again, I think anything between 10 to 12 words or less is being concise and clear and direct. So titles on a title page are bold, centered, and on the upper half of the title page. So typically I start with just making my entire document double spaced, because everything in APA 7th is supposed to be double spaced. And I start 3 lines down from the top of the page, and that's where my title goes. That is pretty much similar to the sample paper that I just sent you the link to as well. And again, it does need to be bolded and centered. And additionally, sometimes some of us in Word or Pages, if it is automatically set up where your first paragraph is indented half an inch off of the left margin. And so if that's the case, and it's an automatic setup in your papers, that might mean that your centered headings get moved over too far. So you will want to check and make sure, because the title heading does need to be centered off of a 0 point left margin. Yes, so I'm sorry. Thanks, Cynthia, for bringing up the issue. Let me send the link again. There you go. Does that work for folks now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, sorry about that. All right, so the other piece too is that in APA 7th, a change from APA 6th edition is that the title is bolded, and additionally that there's a line break between the title on your cover page and then your name. It used to be that everything was all sort of like, there was a break to a new line, but APA 7th is saying that the title on the title page needs to be bolded. Then there needs to be an empty line between the title and your name in terms of that information. So that is a change, and you'll want to keep that in mind. Your author byline, as I said, the next thing after your title will be that break in the space, and then your name. If there are multiple authors, you should order the names of the authors according to their contributions, with the first author doing the most and so on. Now, if you're doing a paper in class and it's a group paper, this is different. So, this APA rule of like authorship is generally more about like scholarship. So people working on a research project and who did the most and to who did the least. If you're doing a group project, you can write it in however you want to do it. Typically what I suggest is like alphabetical by last name. It's just an easy way to sort of do it. That does not necessarily mean to your faculty members that we believe that whoever is first has done the most work. So just and when you're working on group projects, keep in mind that however you want to write the names is fine, but we don't necessarily assume that the order there is based upon who did the most in terms of the work. Additionally, you do want to write all the names on the same line, but if you need to break down to the next line, that's okay. You can do overflow to the next line down if they're, especially you have a big group or folks with long names like myself. And then you follow that with your author affiliation, which would be Department of Counselor Education, comma, space, and then California Lutheran University. That would be what you will have on there. There is, in the manual, it talks about an author's note, and there is no need for an author note on student title page material. So you don't need to use this and you don't need to include this on your work. Additionally, the running head, in the 6th edition, APA required the use of running heads. A 7th edition APA does not, unless it's being submitted for a publication. So for your assignments, there is no need for you to include a running head, but you do need to make sure that you do include the page numbers up at the top and on the right-hand side of your header. Additionally, if you are using a running head, those rules are still the same as previous. And again, this is just if you're submitting for a publication. It's an abbreviated title of no more than 50 characters, including spaces and punctuation. And this is at the top header on the left margin, left justified. And there's no longer any need to include the word running head and then a colon to the left of the running head title on the title page. That's a change in 7th edition as well. Abstracts is another piece that's talked about, and abstracts are often used on theses, dissertations, journal articles to summarize in no more than 250 words, usually, what's included in the manuscript. It's generally written as one paragraph without indentation. So it starts at the left margin and it just goes as a block there. Generally at the end of an abstract, you'll see keywords indented 1/2 inch from the left margin on the next line down, followed by 3 to 5 words or phrases that summarize concepts that are discussed in the article. These are separated by commas and don't have a period or any punctuation at the end. For assignments, other than assignments that would be connected to the thesis class, there is no need for you to write an abstract for any of your papers within the program. In terms of format, I just want to refer you to these sections in chapter 2. So again, there are some helpful pieces to just know about and consider around fonts and what's appropriate for APA. There's a little bit more choice than just Times New Roman now in APA 7. Additionally, how you should sort of think about line spacing, your margins, and paper length. So again, you can sort of get more detail in these sections on your own through the manual if you're interested. In terms of headings, again, the paper that I sent you via the link has examples of some different headings. And so there are 5 levels of headings in APA, but generally for assignments in the program, you shouldn't need more than levels 1, 2, or 3 for your work. So level 1 is used for that top level main section. It is the centered, bolded headings that might be used. Level 2 is meant to be subsections of level 1's topics. And level 3 would be a subsection or a sub-theme of level 2 headings, and then so on and so forth. So you don't want to start your paper with a level 1 introduction heading. The paper title is at the top of the first page of your text, which should act as a de facto introduction heading. You don't need to write the word introduction. We know that it's the intro. And so with the paper title being the first level 1 heading, you can use level 2 headings for further subsections within your introduction or after the introduction. And then from there, after the introduction section, you should use a level 1 heading for the next section of your paper. And again, there are some more rules about this on page 47. The levels of heading, the number of levels of heading needed for a paper will depend on its complexity. So if you are writing a major lit review for a class, then you might have more headings than you might if you were just writing a reflection paper, right? So, but don't make things unnecessarily complicated. But I do encourage folks to use headings because number one, if you're a person who does an outline, those outline posts and headings can be your headings in your paper. Additionally, by using headings, it helps you maybe organize and make sure that what you're writing in that section of the paper is connected to your heading. Um, so sometimes if we are a tangential writer and we sort of get off topic, using headings and putting that in can be a helpful way to sort of like remind us, oh wait, like, yeah, no, this is actually about another thing that comes later. So I should move this section down to that section of the paper. So again, it's helpful just to serve as a guidepost for you, but also for your reader. So these are the examples here on this screen. So level one, centered, bold, title, head casing. So again, if words are meant to be capitalized, then they are capitalized here. Your text would begin as a new paragraph indented on the next line down. In a level two, that's going to be flush to the left margin. So there's no indentation. You just start right where the margin is. And again, it's similar to level one in its formatting. So it's bold and it's title case heading. And again, the text of that paragraph would start the next line down, indented half an inch from the left margin. In level three, what changes is that all of it is still bold and title case heading, but it just becomes italicized. And again, the text will start on the new paragraph indented on the next line down. For level four, again, that would be a sub-theme or a subheading of something that's discussed within level three. You start actually at the half an inch margin in from the left, and then bold headed, not italicized, and it ends with a period. And then the text begins on the same line and continues as a regular paragraph. And again, there's only one space after the period and that concludes the heading, and then your text would begin. And then level five was similar to level four, but it would just be indented. So again, it follows, somewhat mirrors levels 2 and 3 in terms of level 4 and 5, but these are just indented in half an inch from the left margin. And again, it's very rare that you would really need to use a level 4 or a level 5 like headings in most of your assignments. And even for students who do thesis, it's generally not necessary either. So just wanting to share that. Any questions about anything that we've covered in this section? All right. So I'm gonna keep moving us along in terms of just works credited in the text. And again, this is coming from chapter 8. So if it's not your original thought or idea, you must cite the source that informed your claim. So again, if we are talking about things that we ourselves haven't created, for example, theories or concepts that we've learned in the classes that we're taking, then you have to make sure that you are citing them within your work. You can't just sort of have no in-text citations because that starts to get us into a place where you actually can be doing plagiarism, right? And so again, if you haven't crafted it yourself, you have to cite it. And so that's really important. Additionally, if you haven't read the article that you're citing, so if you're reading a textbook that's talking about somebody else's work, you shouldn't just take that textbook's assumptions that they have the right interpretation of somebody else's ideas. You should go to the original source and cite the original source, not do a secondary source from the textbook. Now, sometimes we can't find that original source, so then using a secondary source is fine, but we want to use that very minimally because again, it does lapse us into sort of some unethical pieces if we're basically saying, oh yeah, I'm just pulling this person's reference from the end of their book, but I didn't read it, right? That's just not a good way of conducting our work. Additionally, on page 254, there's some really helpful information about how to cite appropriately. If you're paraphrasing a source in more than one sentence, you don't have to provide an in-text citation for each sentence, as long as it's clear that you're still discussing the same source. Now, at the same time, in a lot of your classes, we want, as faculty, for you to synthesize across multiple sources and talk about how they sort of fit together. So if that is the case, then you will need to give regular in-text citations, parenthetical citations at the end of your sentence about which sources you're pulling from. And so you can't just sort of like put it once at the end of a paragraph and say, okay, I cited. That's probably generally not going to work, and it's not going to be enough in terms of helping us understand what you're pulling from and where each of these ideas is coming from. So I do want to encourage folks to read very closely chapter 8, section 2 of the manual that talks a little bit about plagiarism, and also the different pieces around a direct quote versus paraphrased work. Um, Additionally, I think it's important to recognize that if you are just paraphrasing somebody's work, you do not have to include the page number in from what page you got it from that source, but you do need to do so if you are using a direct quote. So just keep that in mind as you keep working on this work. In terms of citing references in your text, so references in APA publications are cited in text, again, with that author date citation system. And in a reference list, they're listed alphabetically. So left-handers make up 8% to 13% of most human populations, with left-handedness more common in men than in women. So both Gilbert and Wysocki from their article in 1992 and McManus from 1991 both found that similar information. And so in your in-text citations, you're going to start making sure that it is in alphabetical order based upon first author's last name. So even though McManus got their work published first in 1991, the order of the in-text citation, if you're using multiple sources, it is starting with the first author's last name, and then it's connected with a semicolon. In in-text citations, we just use the surnames of the authors. So if they are a junior or a senior or a third, you don't include that information in the in-text citation. You just use the author's last names. And additionally, the date used in the in-text citation should match your reference list. So if there's no date, you would need to write N period D period, which means no date, in the in-text citation where the year would go. And for works that have been accepted for publication but have not been yet published, you would use in press. So let's say if Gilbert and Wysocki, you found theirs online, but it hadn't yet been published formally, you would put Gilbert and Wysocki, comma, in press.
Dr. T, I had a question.
Yeah.
On that last slide,
Yep.
For the example for the left-handers make up 8%,
Mhm.
is the order the years that they were published? I think I missed when you
Yeah,
mentioned.
no. So it's by the I'm sorry, let me go back to it. It is about the first author of each piece and their last name. So in the parenthetical citation, if you were using like these two sources, because Gilbert is the first author of the first article and the first reference, and then McManus, so Gilbert gets listed first in that article, and then McManus follows because of alphabetical order. So in
Oh,
the
okay.
citation, it should run from A through Z.
Oh, got it. Okay, that makes sense. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, of course. So moving to sort of different ways of citing in your work, you may have some work that you would use a narrative citation, which means that you actually include the author's names within the sentence itself. So these are two examples of how a narrative citation might be formatted. So Kessler, and then followed by 2003, the year that Kessler's work was published, found that is an example of including some of that information right within the sentence itself. You could also format it as in 2003, comma, Kessler's study of ... found that, right? That's another way of doing that. if this was just paraphrased and pulled, you wouldn't have to have anything in an in-text citation, parenthetical citation at the end at all. If you were using a direct quote though, or a part of a direct quote to finish out the rest of the sentence, then at the very end, the only thing that you would need to include in parentheses was the page number. So it would be P period space, and then the page number where it came from. If it was information that was coming over 2 pages, it would be PP period space, and then the first page that's on hyphen, and then the last page that it was on. And if you were finding this from an online source that doesn't have page numbers, so let's say it was something that you were finding on a website, then that instead you would actually need to, in parenthetical information at the very end, you would write PARA period, which means paragraph, and then space. And then essentially in a web page, you're asked to count down from the top of the web page to whatever paragraph that is. So if it's the top paragraph, that's paragraph number 1, and then you'd count down from the top of the page to wherever the information that you were citing was in. And so let's say that it was paragraph 6, then it would say PARA period space 6. That would be your end parenthetical citation there. So the parenthetical citation, again, is what is at the end of the sentence. And so if you were citing from Kessler, but you didn't include their name and the year of publication in the actual sentence, then it just comes at the very end before the period. And so that's the other piece to keep in mind. You might also have a parenthetical citation, like the second example here, see Kessler 2003 for more detail, where you're sort of you're discussing something that's connected in the previous sentence, but then you could say something like see Kessler 2003 for more detail to sort of expand on what's being discussed there. For 2 authors, you do have to cite both names every time the reference occurs. So again, I'm going to go back to our dear friends on the previous slide, Gilbert and Wysocki. You can't just drop Wysocki from being a part of the work because they're the second author, they're a partner in that work, right? So for 2 authors, you would have to write out Gilbert and Wysocki every single time, whether it's in the narrative citation or whether it's in the parenthetical citation. However, if you have 3 or more authors, you are just now in APA 7th required to list the first author and then et al. In every single citation, including the first one. So it used to be that you would have to write all of them out the first time that you use them in your work. And then every subsequent citation would be the first author's last name and then et al. In APA 7th, they've switched that around. So let's say that it's Kessler and colleagues who are writing this, then it would be Kessler et al. And the period is after the al, not after the et. And additionally, there's no comma after Kessler or the first author's last name. So it would just be the author's last name, space, et, and then a space, and then al period. And then you can see on page 266 has various citation formats. So it's a very helpful table. I encourage you to take a look at that in the manual. When you're using multiple references by the same author and the same publication year, you would include a lowercase letter after the year. So you would have, let's say, Kessler. There were 2 articles from Kessler that both got published in 2003. So you might identify in your reference list which one is 2003A, and then the second one would be 2003B. And then when you're in your text and you're writing up your work, you would just want to be very clear about which source you were pulling from for each of the specific references. And again, using 2003A or 2003B within your sentence structure. I'm going to refer you to page 272 and look at table 8.2 for some examples of direct quotes cited in the text, again, just to give you some reference points. And additionally, recognizing too that if you use a direct quote that's 40 words or more, then you do need to format it as a block quote, which means that the entire quote needs to be indented half an inch from the left margin. And there's a specific way of doing that. So you'll want to consult with a section 27 in chapter 8 about some of the examples about how to format those. I would say though that we want to use direct quotes that are block quotes, like 40 words. That's a lot of words. So you may want to try to minimize the use of those as much as possible if you can. Yeah, so I'm going to move to also talking a little bit about exceptions from references. So if you're doing an interview, if you're doing anything that requires a personal communication reference, such as a telephone call, an email, those are not included in the reference list itself. You do not have to put that there. You would, however, if you're pulling from direct information in a paper, then you would need to use the parenthetical citation that's listed here as an example of the first initial of the person that you interviewed and then their last name, followed by a comma, and then personal communication, comma, and then the date that you actually did that interview or you had the communication with them. Now, you will want to check with your faculty members though. So sometimes you have an interview paper that's required as an assignment. And like for me, generally, I don't have students do the personal communication citations, partly because if you did that, then suddenly all of the space that you would have for a 3-page paper gets taken up by your citations. And I know that it's an interview that you've had to do because this is the assignment that I've provided to you. So check with your faculty member in each class when you have a new faculty member to understand what they want in terms of APA citations. Some faculty members will want you to include citations, like when you're doing an interview of somebody with a personal reference or a personal communication reference. For others, like me, they won't. And so you do want to just check in with folks to see how they want you to do it. You do not need to use personal communication for quotes or information from participants who you interviewed as a part of your own original research though. So if you do a thesis and let's say that you do qualitative work, you do not have to do a personal communication citation for that. We do want to use personal communication citations only when a recoverable source is not available. So again, this is like if no one else has said it, then we would use a personal communication. And if they haven't written about it. So if they've written a blog, if they've done anything, if there's a newspaper article that they have said similar things, then your better choice is going to actually go to those and use those to pull into your work than doing personal communication. But if you can't, personal communication is a good fallback. Any questions before we move on to talking about the reference list?
Dr. T, I have a question.
Of course.
How would you cite something from video?
Yeah, so let's let me see. I'm opening up my my manual just to look and see, because there is a way to do that. Let me just look.
Dr. T, I believe it's in 342.
342, thank you. Great, yeah. So if you are having to cite a video, like for those of you in 581, if you have to cite from the Our Spirits Don't Speak English video, right? Then what the format there on 142 at the bottom would be that you would cite whoever the director is, and then the year that it came out, and then the title of the film is italicized with the first word capitalized. So R in that case would be capitalized, but then everything else would be lowercase. And then there's a bracket that has film written in it. So you have to have a first bracket, a left bracket, then film with capital F. And then a period after the last bracket, and then the company that that basically published or put the film out. So if you look in, for example, Our Spirits Don't Speak English, because you have to go to Canopy, all of that information is listed in Canopy, and you should be able to find that and then cite from that. And that's for your reference list. In the in-text citations, if you were pulling something from the in-text citation, then you would put the director's information and then the year that it came out, and that would be the ways that you would include that in the in-text citation. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. That was page 142?
342.
Oh, 342. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions before we move on to reference list information? Okay. So I'm going to point you to chapter 9 in section 4 of that chapter on page 283 has a really helpful overview of what to include in your reference list material. And figure 9.1 shows you where to find those elements from a journal article source, particularly given the fact that a lot of assignments for your classes will be asking you to pull specifically from journal article sources. But again, as we noted, you know, the manual now has information like how to cite from Twitter, right? How to cite from social media sites. So it has lots of different information in the actual manual about how you need to cite from different types of sources that you might find information relevant for some of your assignments. So I do encourage you to take a look very closely at that. In terms of the punctuation in the reference list, a period appears after each reference list element. So after the author, after the date, after the title, and after the source. But at the very end, you have to include the DOI link from a journal article source, and you should not put a period there because it will actually not allow the link to work, right? So a DOI, the digital object identifier, is meant to be a way for somebody who comes across your work to find that source themselves. And so they would actually copy and paste it into a web browser, and it should take them to where you found that original source. If you put a period, it becomes a part of the web address and it won't allow the link to work. So we don't want to put a period there at the end of the DOI. You use punctuation marks such as a comma or a parentheses around parts of the same reference element. So for example, if you're pulling information from the journal about the issue or the volume number, that is going to be either in parenthetical or it's going to have commas around it. The page numbers also are partly from the journal and the source. So that's why there's not periods after all of those. The period at the end means that that's where the source material is coming from. And we'll look at some examples in just a minute to sort of go over that further. When you write the reference list, you invert all of the author's names with their last name first, followed by a comma, and then the initials of their first and middle name if they have one. So again, the example here of author, comma, a period, right? That's just an example of sort of the formatting ways that happens. You use a comma to separate an author's initials from the additional author's names. So even when there's only two authors, you do have to use the ampersand before the final author's name. So you do need to make sure that if you have the and sign, that there's a comma before that in your list. You do need to provide the surnames and initials, so the last name and the first names, first initials, for up to and including 20 authors. So that's very rare for the types of work that we pull. It's more common in like science, like hard science backgrounds where you might have like a huge research team. But if you ever do come across a journal article that has 21 or more authors, you do need to include the first 19 authors' names, and then you insert an ellipses, but no ampersand, and then you add the final author's names. So again, in chapter 10, example 4 gives an example of this. A common mistake that I see is that folks take that rule about alphabetical order, and so what they will do is they will switch around. So if there's like 3 authors' names, let's say that it's Jones, or let's say that it's Shu, Jones, and Harper. That they take the notion that everything has to be in alphabetical order, and they'll switch it in the reference list so that it is Harper, Jones, and Shu that are in how they sort of format it. That's an incorrect sort of thing to do, right? So the order of how an author's order is like for their work, and how it's listed on a book or a book chapter or a journal article, again, references the amount of work that they've done on that project. So if they're the first author, that means that they have done the most work on that project. And so their name needs to be listed first, even if it's not alphabetical order. So you, as you put in your reference list, just need to make sure that the reference list from the top of your page to the bottom of your page is in alphabetical order by the first author's last name. But when you're pulling from a source and you're writing in the entry for that specific reference, you don't want to change around and make sure that the authors, if you have multiple authors, that they're written from A through Z. Go with what is listed in the article itself. Does that make sense for folks? All right, so when we talk about the reference list, there are a few different types that I'm going to just go through as examples. Specifically books, a chapter out of a book, a journal article, and a web citation. So for a book, again, generally when we're doing this type of a book, so if you're citing from a textbook, you would have the first author's last name written first in a reference list, followed by a comma, then a space, then their first initial followed by a period, another space, and then if they have a middle initial, then you'd write that in with a period. Then you do a space, and then the year of publication of that book, which you would find on usually the first couple pages in the book, right? Will list the year of publication. That's in parentheses, and then that's followed by a period. You do a space, and then the title of the book is italicized. And again, the first word of a title is capitalized. The first word of a subtitle, so if it has a colon and then a subtitle after the title, that also, the first word is capitalized. And then if there's a proper noun in the title, that is also capitalized. But if not, then everything else in the title needs to be lowercase. So in the example here, you see student development in college, theory, research, and practice. That is the title of this book that, that has been cited. And so student is capitalized, theory is capitalized because it's the first word of the subtitle, but every other word is lowercase. Now, let's say that we had student development in college in the United States. Well, then United States would be capitalized as well, right? So that's an example of a proper noun that would be capitalized. After the title, there's a period and then a space, and then you just need to include the publisher. So whoever is the publisher, that's the information that comes there. So as you can see, this example is written out and the publisher is Josie Bass. In APA 6, that used to be that you also needed to include the publisher's location. And in 7th edition, the publisher, it is just the publisher. So again, if you were familiar with APA in the past, this is a change. And so you just need to delete the location of the publisher. That is no longer necessary. For a chapter in a book, it's very similar to what we've just sort of talked about in terms of the book. But if you're specifically taking a chapter in a book, the title of the chapter or the entry is needing to be non-italicized. And again, only the first word of the title or proper nouns need to be capitalized. Everything else is lowercase. Then that is followed by listing out the editors of the actual book. So you would write in and then the editor's names, and this is reverse order from how it is at the start of the citation. So you would put their first initial period and then the last name of the first author, then followed by a comma, then the first initial and maybe middle initial of the second author, the second editor, then comma. And then after all of the editors' names appear, you would write capital EDS period in parentheses, followed by a comma. And then the title of the book follows what we've just covered. So it does need to be italicized. And again, the first word and of the title and the first word of any subtitle need to be capitalized and everything else lowercase. And then that's followed by the page range of where the chapter appears in that book. So you, in parentheses, you would write PP period, and then a space, and then the first page of the where the chapter shows up, and then the last page in between you put the hyphen, and that's all in parentheses, followed by a period and then a space and then the publisher again. So again, as the example shows here, Wren and Patton wrote the chapter called Campus Ecology and Environments, but that is in J.H. Shu, S.R. Jones, and S.R. Harper's edited book called Student Services, a Handbook for the Profession, which is italicized. And then if it's a multiple edition, you also need to include that. So it's the 5th edition, followed by the comma, and the PP period starts on 242 and runs to 257, and it's printed by Josie Bass. A journal article is similar to what we have covered similar in previous, right? But there are a little bit of difference. So again, you would put your authors followed by the year that it's published. The title of the article, again, is not italicized. The thing that is italicized is the journal name. So you would write the journal name and then also the volume number of that specific journal is also italicized. Then the issue number is in parentheses, not italicized, followed by the page range of the journal article. And then the DOI needs to be included as well. And so as you can see down here in the example, this is an article that I published in 2015. It's from the Journal of Student Affairs Research and Practice, and it's their volume 52, issue number 1, and it falls out on pages 64 to 75. The journal title, or I'm sorry, the article title is Critical Influences on Sexual Minority College Males' Meaning Making of Their Multiple Identities. And the DOI, if you clicked on that link, if you copied and pasted this link, it would take you to that journal's website and specifically to this article for you to be able to download. So you do need to make sure that you have the DOI if it's provided. Now, one of the things that I've told students, and some of them are on this and already have heard it from me, sometimes it gets a little confusing because if you find a journal article through the website, through the databases from the library's website on campus, sometimes it'll give you the start of the DOI, but then it will include this like easyproxy.callutheran.edu as a part of the link. And that is not going to be helpful because that if you click on that link, it's going to take you to the databases at the library. And so folks who aren't affiliated with Cal Lutheran will never be able to be taken directly to your article that you're citing from. So you do want to make sure that you are pulling that out. And instead, you always start off with the HTTPS colon, and then the slashes, doi.org, and then wherever the number starts, that's really the DOI material that starts. And generally, it's always going to start with a 10. Now, there are some cases that it doesn't start with a 10, but usually that's sort of where you can tell what the start of the DOI is. So you could just copy that paste and then attach it to the HTTPS beginning part. You can also go to a website called crossref.org. And if you click on that, it'll pop up a metadata file. And if you put in the citation itself, it will automatically populate the DOI address for you. And so that's oftentimes what I will do when I can't find or it's not easily accessible what the DOI is. I will go to that website, I will plug it in, and generally it will find me a DOI. If it doesn't pop up with anything, then there has not been a DOI assigned to it, so you don't have to worry about it. But generally, if there is a DOI, you are asked to include it. In APA 7th, the DOI links should be actually hyperlinked in your word processing program. So if it's blue font underline, that's fine. It's actually appropriate to APA citation. So that's not a problem. And again, you should copy and paste the DOI or the URL link directly from your web browser into your reference list to avoid transcription errors. So sometimes if you type it along from the page, then you might get it wrong, right? So if you just copy and paste it in, it should be okay. And again, you don't want to add a period after the link because again, it will most likely break the link and not make it work correctly. So that is the information that I have for everybody for today. But again, if there are specific questions that you need help answered, I'm happy to answer any of those. So anything that folks have as questions. All right. Well, thank you for being here. I hope this was somewhat helpful for you. I hope that you might have some new takeaways and some reminders about things. This has been recorded. It will be posted up on our Resources for Students page. So if you have and want to look at it down the line, you can refer back to it once it's up on YouTube. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope that you have good luck with APA for the rest of the semester and as you move forward in the program. And if there are ever questions, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to consult with you. All right. Have a good rest of your weekend, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.